Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning. Welcome to Daily Faith Builder. We're closing out this week in this idea of joy, the joy of community, and looking at chapter 1 of the book of Philippians and how to stir up joy and how does community and the different aspects of community we see that Paul shared with the Philippians, how does that stir up and develop joy in our hearts? In the midst of that, and this last thing we're going to look at this week is joy is intimately connected to how we view life and death. And so a big question for us is life worth living without joy? That's a big one. Is life worth living without joy? In other words, are we content just to go through life with just moments of happiness? Remember, happiness is something we can create in our lives. We can do things to make ourselves feel happy. And the question, though, is anytime we say, oh, I'm joyful, or that makes me joyful, the question is, what's the source of my joy? And in other words, and even when we talk about things that make us happy, what's the source of that happiness, right? In other words, are we content with really just moments of happiness? The reality is Jesus has come, right, to bring joy, to bring a whole nother level of living with something inside our heart far bigger than happiness, but something that is from the outside, and something we don't have the capacity to do ourselves with. His joy is God's life inside our soul. And he promises in John 15:11, it's an amazing promise that Jesus says his desire is that his joy, the joy of God will be inside our hearts, and that our joy will be overflowing. Boy, what a promise. And I think, and a lot of the times in our sharing the gospel and talking about the gospel, remember at the beginning of the week we talked about when we think of God, do we think of joy? When we think of Jesus, do we think of joy? And when people think of Christians, do they think of joy? When people think of church, do they think of joy? We have a lot of work to do to recover that in many ways. You look back in history, way back in history, and as the pagans and the heathens and those outside of the church looked at the church, many times they in the midst of even really tough times, they characterize the church as they're joyful. They have something about them that transcends their circumstances, and it was joy. And this is what Paul says here in the end of chapter 1, this idea that joy is intimately connected to how we view life and death. And the reality is death is the greatest joy killer. Unless we have a power, a life, a salvation that is greater than death. And again, it is only happiness. It is not joy unless that joy is rooted in something that is and has defeated the power of death. And the only thing that has done that is Jesus. He's the only one, and therefore he is the source of joy, and the one who can give you joy and can instill that joy into your soul. And Paul, speaking about this joy of knowing Christ and the worth of knowing him, in verse 20 and 21, he says, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, to die is gain. This is the perspective and reality of a person, right? Of Paul, who had fully understood, right, what the gospel had done for his life when he says to live is Christ, to die is gain. And he goes on in verse 25 and he says this, convinced of this, that he says, it would be much better for me to go and it's better for me to be with Christ. So in other words, it's better for me to die, Paul said, but I know that it is helpful for you Philippians for me to continue on. And he says this in verse 25, convinced of this, that I will stay on to bear fruit with you. I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and your joy in the faith. And so, you see Paul's heart, that his heart of working with others to get the gospel in their heart, to get joy in their heart, that there would be a real solid understanding of the victory over death, the greatest joy killer, that Paul's work, his gospel work was getting Christ formed in others and obviously in the Philippian church. And just to close this week out, I just encourage us all just to think about this idea when we engage each other. Do we have a an understanding or a desire like Paul did with his affection of Christ for others to see Christ formed in each other? Are we aware of each other's mental state, emotional state? And are we praying for each other and trying to instill joy right into each other? Do we bring joy into the discussion? Do we bring joy into the Christmas dinner table? Do we bring joy when we're talking to frustrated people more and more out in our communities with everything going on? We should be people of joy. And we need to be honest with each other because we all struggle in times of really wrestling, especially in these times. Boy, we struggle, don't we? We need to encourage each other, pray for each other, lay hold of Jesus' promise that he desires to put his joy, the joy of God, inside our soul and for that to overflow right to others. Have a wonderful weekend. God bless.